I am currently the CTO at Instill. Instill is a purpose-driven software company, purpose-built specifically to empower nonprofits to do good work. It's been a wonderful experience working with them, but I have been in LA in tech for a long time, and I've worked at Yahoo, MySpace, Edgecast, and most recently Signal Sciences. I'm I'm very passionate about product vision, driving product vision to implementation. I love building engineering culture that's agile and data driven. And I love being in LA because I get to eat, I get to snowboard, and I get to do a ton of hiking. So I've been doing remote work for a while. In some cases, I didn't even realize it. And I want to walk you through my journey. This is obviously my own personal experience. Not all remote types of work are right for everybody. So this is just kind of more of the good and bad as I've seen it, and things that I think we can all do better in general. So how did I get started in remote work? Straight out of college, in the prehistoric age of technology, I became a technology consultant with Price Waterhouse. And what I didn't really appreciate as much back then and didn't realize is consulting is entirely a remote job. There are offices everywhere, but you're rarely in the office as a consultant. You're either at a client side, often working with a team you've never worked with before, and often actually outside of your city where you live, or you're on the beach, which means you're not on a project, and then you're at home just waiting to be called out to your next client. Pricewaterhouse did a phenomenal job managing a remote workforce because they were incredibly deliberate and intentional about everything that they did. And deliberate and intentional are words that I'm going to use a lot throughout this presentation. For example, they had very clear communication channels. So as a consultant, I always knew what to expect when and where and how. I knew how I would get the call. I knew what type of information I would get. And I had an entire support team that would make sure that I was able to make it to my client with all the right information. They had a ton of documentation. Everybody knew where it was. It was very clear and very accessible. They provided structured and unstructured training. Some of it you had to take to be able to level up. Some of it was just for you to ramp up your technology skills. Every employee had a coach. So in addition to the training that they provided you, they actually gave you a career coach who helped manage your career and was invested in you outside of the scope of the client work that you're doing. Projects were very clearly scoped and they had success metrics. So you always knew when you were doing a good job and when you weren't. And there were a ton of opportunities to really grow and level up your skills. Since consulting, I've had the luxury of working in remote environments for many reasons, either through acquisitions or because of workforce expansion. There's many reasons why people go into remote work, and I'll go through that through my next set of slides. But I kind of break down remote work into 3 different types of work. And so I'm going to go through them here. So obviously my experience with different remote environments, redundant slides, sorry about that. But the first one I want to talk about, which after consulting was also my first experience in split remote. What is split remote environments? Split remote just literally means that you have offices. Your offices are just spread in different locations, and teams are working out of those offices in those different locations. Split remote is really office-based. You generally have the office is split either by function. You have a sales office maybe in another continent, and then you have your engineering resources in a central place. There's often a lot of collaboration within a particular office. Oftentimes not as much collaboration across offices because you really want to be able to empower the offices to be independently successful. So why are there split remote offices? So some of my experiences, it's because of acquisitions. Either you acquire a company because it adds value to your business and that company happens to be in a different location, or you get acquired by a much larger company because you have an awesome business and then you have to figure out how to make it work with a larger mothership somewhere else. I had experienced this at Yahoo, at Stamps, and at Edgecast. With Yahoo, in addition to acquisitions, you also got access to a more cost-effective talent pool. So when I joined Yahoo, they were doing a massive expansion into India and investing quite heavily into having a huge tech talent in India. And part of the work that we all had to do as engineers is be able to develop a process of how we work with the India teams. At MySpace, we did a few things. We used it to expand our talent pool. So we opened up offices in the Bay Area and we opened up our office in Seattle. But we also used it to expand to new regions, particularly because it was sales driven. And that happened at Edgecast as well. Some of the challenges that I've seen with split remote offices is that, there's this concept of your headquarters, which becomes the mothership. And there's always the sense that everybody in the mothership knows everything that's going on, but the satellite offices don't. Another thing that I've experienced firsthand is just cultural differences between offices. And if you're not really prepared to address those or handle them, they can really become an obstacle. This is something that we experienced at Yahoo when we first started working with the India teams, because there's very particular ways of how you need to do communication and manage projects. And it took us a little while to figure that out. So we got off to a rough start and we had to smooth things as we learned about each other. Some of the successes I've seen with remote work is seeding the new office with a high ranking executive. At Edgecast, I thought that we did a great job building out our London office because we had one of the founders move there. He was the first person in that office. He hired the team. And instead of that office being a satellite office that was off all by itself, it actually became very interesting for other people in the LA, which was the headquarters office, to want to move there and be a part of that team. It's really important to also treat the offices as equivalents. And it doesn't mean that they're equal, but we want to make sure that you're giving everybody what they need to be successful and feel like you're investing in them. So for example, you may want to have happy hours in particular offices, but if you have an office in Dubai or Abu Dhabi, maybe happy hour isn't the right thing to do, but you can do something very similar to make the team feel like you've invested in them. Empowering teams with autonomy. This is something that we struggled with when we started expanding our engineering team at MySpace, is how do you give your remote teams autonomy so they're not relying on the headquarters to actually figure out what to do and how to move next. And so we went with a model where the different offices actually own different parts of the product so they can execute on them end to end without needing to come back to a main source. The one thing that I learned the hard way is, especially for me as a leader and as an executive, is it's important to visit the satellite offices fairly often. We had one engineer in the Seattle office at MySpace that would panic every time I would show up because he swore he was going to get fired, and he wasn't. He never did. And but it just told me that I'm not there enough and they're not used to seeing me. So when I do show up, it feels like it's a pretty big deal. The second type of remote work is hybrid remote. And hybrid remote still means that you have a primary office, but you have a remote workforce and less than 50% of your employees are working outside of the office. So they will need to come into the office fairly frequently, either for meetings or for collaboration. I experienced hybrid remote at Small Demons and Signal Sciences, and it was specifically because we were fairly small startups. We were competing in this hiring market with a lot of the big guns like the Googles of the world, and we needed to be able to find good talent. And what we were able to do is expand our talent pool to people that wanted to work remotely and work from home and were interested in working on new startups and new interesting projects. I think the biggest challenge I saw in hybrid remote is the fact that even though we said we were remote, we still had an office first mentality. And that meant things like collaboration and communication was still required if it required you to be in the office. It meant that conversations were being had in person that people that were remote weren't privy to. And then you had all of these ad hoc social events that would happen that would make the remote people feel like they're not particularly included or part of the team. It created the sense that if you're remote, you're missing out and you're not getting the same opportunities. To really make hybrid remote successful, we actually had to be super intentional about that and take a remote first approach, even though the majority of our team was actually working out of the office. And this meant that we had to make sure that all of our communication was happening either through Confluence or through Slack. We had to make sure that we were managing around the ad hoc events by scheduling events and making the remote people be able to stay the night if they had to, just so they can get to know each other and participate. And then we created spaces in the office for when the remote people came in. So they had lockers where they could leave their stuff because they didn't have permanent desks. And we had floating desks that they could participate in. And that actually made a really big difference in people's level of investment and involvement. And finally, and I think this is something that a lot of companies have been talking about and struggling with a lot recently, is fully remote. And fully remote is exactly what it says. And this is actually one of my favorite videos. It shows what life as a fully remote person looks like, but it just means that you're all working from completely independent locations. There is no office for anybody to go to. There are opportunities to meet, but they're predominantly done remotely via Zoom or Hangouts or whatever the tool that your company wants to use is. So why would you go fully remote? Well, I think the first one is pretty clear. COVID hit everybody really hard, and a lot of companies had to scramble to figure out how to support their business and keep everything running smoothly without bringing people into the office and putting them at risk of getting sick. Obviously, it gives you access to a much, much larger talent pool. And I mean, especially for us as a startup at Instill, it was a cost reduction effort because we had originally budgeted for opening an office at some point. But then when COVID hit, we decided to just go fully remote. And that's just been our policy going on. So some of the challenges that we've seen with remote work, really it's building the human connections. A lot of our interactions are over Zoom, they're over Slack, and they tend to revolve very much around getting work done, talking about work things. So it makes it really hard to build those human connections. Collaboration and brainstorming is a bit challenging. I think there's quite a few tools out there that are trying to help bridge that gap. FigJam most recently has been my favorite, but there's Miro and other tools that people are using to try and circumvent that. But there's still the sense that to get in a room physically with everybody else makes it a lot easier. I think it also makes it harder when you're remote to do larger brainstorming sessions. I think what we've been doing is really breaking them down into smaller brainstorming sessions and then bringing the findings together and having discussions that way. Onboarding new employees when you're remote is also more challenging. You have to be incredibly thoughtful and have the process very, very mapped out and make sure that your employees are being invested in and supported through the entire onboarding process until they feel they're able to contribute. And I think for a lot of people, finding a work-life boundary within the space that you're working in was also quite challenging. A lot of people live where they work where they live, and at what point do you begin living and at what point do you stop working? And I think that was a challenge. I think a lot of people might have tended to get overworked initially when they moved into a fully remote model. I think things that we have to keep in mind, especially at Instill, because this is something we're very committed to, is we're a fairly small company now, but we have a very specific culture that we make sure to nurture, and we want to make sure that we're able to scale that and are thoughtful about it as the company continues to grow. The more people that you have, the larger the company gets, the more thoughtful you have to be and deliberate about how you're building out your culture and scaling it out. It's just, you have to stay connected consistently with our employees. So, I make sure that I have one-on-ones with everybody all the time, but we also want to build bridges between different people that may not work together, just to kind of build those human connections. It's really important to have a very good hiring and onboarding process for employees, especially ones that are more junior with less experience. You bring on somebody more senior and you have the expectation that they can take on an idea and implement it. And you want to be able to give less experienced employees a lot more guidance. And so you have to have a very deliberate and thoughtful hiring and onboarding process. And then, you do have access to a larger remote workforce, but the challenge is when you're working with other states or even internationally, there's a lot of hiring logistics you have to think through. And then there's the perceived challenges of fully remote work. I mean, one of them is just this concept of reduced productivity. Everybody thinks that, they're not in the office. People are just not paying attention. They're busy with their families. They're distracted. They're taking naps. That's not accurate at all. There's a lot of statistics there that will tell you that you actually, by reducing the commute time, and people have saved over 8 hours of commute time on average, you're actually increasing people's productivity. You're increasing their levels of happiness. They're just a lot more able to focus because there's so many distractions in the office. So there's a lot of studies right now and a lot of stats around this that I'm happy to share if anybody's interested in learning more about this. The other challenge, and I think people are very worried about this, is just security risks. But the reality of security risks is that the biggest security risks to any company and really to any individual are all really designed to exploit the human element. Things like phishing, things like bad credentials, things like your unsecured devices. Those are risks regardless of whether an employee is in the office or not. Those are things that we have to address and do education around. So is it more risky from a security perspective? There might be some level of risk, but I think if you have the right trust network around your tooling and around your products, it is a very easily solvable problem. So fully remote successes. I mentioned this a little earlier, but reducing the commute, especially if you're in LA and you live in Pasadena and you have you want to work in Manhattan Beach, the commute is unbearable. So being able to take that commute out of it, one, takes away the stress, takes away time that you're on the road, and really just makes people happier and more productive. Again, so that creates maximum productivity. There's a lot less noise and distractions, and people tend to be generally happier. And like I said, this is not for everybody. Not everybody is going to love doing remote work, but there are reasons why it's a good thing. And if it's right for you, then it's a wonderful thing. So how do we make remote work for us, regardless of what type of remote environment you're working in? So the how. I think, again, intentional. It's really important that remote work is something that you commit to making happen and becomes part of your company culture. Remote work can't just happen to your company, because then you're not planning for it. You're always trying to avoid it. And you will then fall into bad habits of how communication happens, and people will tend to feel isolated. They don't know what's going on, and that doesn't really help people become more productive. So if any company wants to be involved in remote work, it has to be an incredibly intentional, thoughtful process, and something that you continue to work on and think about as your company grows. So what are the work that has to go into this? Culture. Culture is a very overused word in some cases, but it is something that, again, is really important. You really have to understand what the scope and culture of your company is. And for remote, you have to create a culture that encourages familiarity and inclusiveness. You have to be very thoughtful and plan around how to engage people with each other, how to give people a sense of belonging, a sense of knowing what's going on with the company, so that we know we're all in it together and nobody's feeling isolated. It's really important to unite your team members around a shared goal, and it's important to report progress on that regularly. We're all working, especially for us at Instill, we're all a fairly small startup. We're all working on the same goal. We're trying to onboard our first set of pilot customers right now. This is a goal that we talk about fairly regularly. Everybody knows what that goal is, and everybody knows what their part in it is. So we all feel like we're in it together. It's important to plan remote-friendly social activities. So not every Zoom needs to be a work-related Zoom. We've done some scavenger hunts. We do a weekly lunch where we all just get together and chat about random things. It's just important to create that sense where you can just become humans with each other without having to have it within the context of work. And celebrate things, celebrate people having babies, celebrate people's kids going to preschool, just celebrate accomplishments with the work itself, recognize each other as humans as well as coworkers. Communication is so important. And again, it's really, really important that you are very clear and very deliberate about your communication channels. You want to make sure that you know how people should use Slack and what channels they should use to be able to discuss things, at what point they should be able to use Confluence, how is email used. I think it's good to be clear about that and to evolve it as your company is growing, so people know how to consume information and how to expect that to happen. Share information regularly and publicly. Talk about things that are in your head, even if you think somebody knows it. Odds are somebody doesn't know it. And because we are in a remote environment, the more that you say things, even if you're repeating yourself, it's just really important for everybody to know what's going on and feel like they understand the big picture and what the goals are. Be clear and explicit. Again, like, people can't read your minds, especially if you're far away and you can't read each other's body language really well. I think it's really important to try and be as clear as possible around what makes you happy, what doesn't make you happy, what you want, what you're missing, and be very explicit about your needs. It's the best way to communicate. So there's no guessing. Nobody's wondering how somebody's thinking about something or feeling about something. Encourage conversations and questions in shared communication channels. Try and avoid one-on-one conversations as much as possible, because if somebody has a question, odds are somebody else has the same question. We can all learn from each other. Establish guidelines around when do you have a Zoom meeting and what can be a quick Slack discussion, so there's no Zoom fatigue. And communication is important, but also scheduling non-communication time is important. I think a lot of us are suffering from Zoom fatigue. And so having set times where, like for us, for example, Thursdays and Fridays tend to be no meeting days. It doesn't mean that you can't schedule a meeting. It just means that people will really respect that time and try to give you like those chunks of time where you can actually get to do some work. Empathy and vulnerability, also incredibly important. You have to check in with each other very regularly, just see how people are doing, see how you're doing. If you're facing a particular challenge, you should feel comfortable talking about it, because it will also give people the room to discuss their challenges with you. And it helps you bond, it helps you build that culture together, and it just helps you support each other. And then welcome flexibility. You trust each other. You know that people are doing the best that they can. People are at home. They have different considerations. Expect that to give people the room to balance their life and families in the way that makes sense, and that they will do the work that needs to get done in their own time. Transparency is also incredibly important, all the way from being very transparent about the company goals and objectives, having weekly all-hand meetings where everybody's able to learn what's going on weekly with the company, but also have it open so people can ask questions. Encourage, again, everybody to discuss all topics in shared channels so we all could learn from each other, and make transparency and predictability also part of your product development process. Trust. Remote work, you cannot not trust the people that you work with. So you have to lead with trust and then go on from there. Micromanagement is a no-starter. If you're trying to build a team and you're micromanaging people, that's going to cause stress on you. It's going to cause stress on them and reduce productivity. There's just no point. So always lead with trust. Communicate clearly and honestly. Build a framework where people know that you're being clear and honest with them. They know that, if there's a problem, you're going to tell it to them, and that also when they do good work, that you're also going to let them know as well. And then make sure that you're listening to what people are saying and that you're hearing not just the words that they're saying, but actually how they're feeling about something. So it's not just about you communicating your own thoughts, but also how you're receiving other people's communication. Hiring, create a very predictable interview process. Structure is going to be really important. Order of is really important. Make sure the candidate knows what the process looks like and why, and the people that are involved in the process knows their role in it, so that you're not asking the same questions 5 times in a row. Setting up a formal onboarding process is also incredibly important. So for us, when a new hire starts, they have a GitHub ticket with all of the tasks. They get assigned a buddy that helps them go through their journey until they feel like they're able to function independently. And then we have weekly new hire lunches where it's an opportunity for the new hire to be introduced. Often they're introduced in an MC capacity by another one of our coworkers, and it gives them a chance to get to know the company, because we all go around and just share things about the different, we pick a theme for the lunch and we just share things about ourselves. So it's a great way for people to learn about each other outside of just a work context. So I'm a little bit over on time, but I think the final thought, having kind of gone through this so many times and putting this deck together, is that whether it's communication, transparency, trust, all of these things they are important for remote work, but the reality is these are all things that we should have been doing all along. They're all things that are really important for you to build a good company and a good culture. We had just assumed that being face-to-face solved a lot of these problems, but in the reality, it actually didn't. So regardless of the type of remote environment that you have, regardless of whether you're in the office a lot or not, I think focusing on these things, being deliberate and intentional about it, is going to be really important and just help build more successful teams. And that's it for me.